Hi, I'm Weird Wacky, and welcome to a tour of some of history's most spectacular faceplants. We're talking about the top worst military mistakes in history, the kind of oops moments that don't just lose a battle but redraw maps and reroute the entire river of time. These aren't just minor tactical errors, they are colossal blunders, born from a potent cocktail of arrogance, misinformation, and sometimes just plain bad luck. From the frozen plains of Russia to the grassy hills of Montana, we're going to explore how the grand ambitions of generals and emperors can crumble into dust because of one or sometimes a series of catastrophic miscalculations. These aren't just stories of defeat, they are pivotal moments that altered the destinies of entire empires and nations. Imagine a world where Napoleon conquered Russia, or where Germany succeeded in its two-front war. History as we know it would be unrecognizable. The mistakes we'll discuss today are so profound that they serve as eternal lessons in the annals of military strategy. Case studies taught at war colleges about what not to do. They demonstrate that no army, no matter how powerful or technologically advanced, is immune to the fatal flaws of human judgment. So get ready as we dive into 5 epic military blunders that shaped our world. We'll see how overconfidence, poor planning, and a stubborn refusal to adapt led to some of the most infamous disasters in the history of warfare. It's a journey that reveals a fundamental truth, that the course of history often hinges not on the strength of an army's swords or guns, but on the wisdom, or lack thereof, of its leaders. Let's get started. Let's begin in 1812 with a man who was, by all accounts, a military genius, Napoleon Bonaparte. At the height of his power, he commanded the Grande Armée, the largest European army ever assembled at that point, with over 600,000 soldiers. His goal? To bring Tsar Alexander I of Russia to heel and enforce the continental system. Napoleon, having conquered most of Europe, was supremely confident. He famously remarked, "I have come once and for all to finish with these barbarians of the north." The sword is now drawn. He expected a quick, decisive battle, a swift victory, and a triumphant return to Paris. What he got instead was a 6-month nightmare that would signal the beginning of his end. The Russians, under the command of Mikhail Kutuzov, refused to play Napoleon's game. Instead of meeting the Grande Armée in a glorious, winner-take-all battle, they adopted a scorched earth policy. As Napoleon's forces advanced deeper into the vastness of Russia, they found only burned villages and empty fields. The supply lines, already stretched to their breaking point, completely fell apart. The Grande Armée, designed for rapid campaigns in the well-provisioned lands of Central Europe, was not prepared for the desolate, endless Russian steppe. Soldiers began to starve, and disease, particularly typhus, ran rampant through the ranks long before the first snowflake fell. And then came the winter. Not just any winter, but the infamous General Winter. The retreat from Moscow became one of the great disasters in military history. Temperatures plummeted to unimaginable lows. Soldiers froze to death in their sleep, horses perished by the thousands, and discipline evaporated. The once mighty Grande Armée was reduced to a starving, freezing mob, harassed constantly by Cossack raiders. Of the more than 600,000 men who marched into Russia, fewer than 100,000 staggered out. Napoleon had underestimated his enemy, the terrain, and the climate. This catastrophic failure shattered the myth of his invincibility and created a power vacuum in Europe that would ultimately lead to his downfall at Waterloo. Our next blunder takes us to the Crimean War, specifically the Battle of Balaclava on October 25, 1854. This is the scene of one of the most famous and most tragic military actions in history, the charge of the Light Brigade. The situation was chaotic. The British and their allies were fighting the Russians for control of the port of Sevastopol. During the battle, the Russians were attempting to capture a series of redoubts or small forts on the Causeway Heights, which would have given them a commanding position. The British commander, Lord Raglan, seeing the Russians carrying away captured British cannons from these forts, decided he had to act. He wanted to send his cavalry to stop them. This is where everything went catastrophically wrong, a tragic story of miscommunication. Lord Raglan, from his high vantage point, dictated an order for the cavalry to advance rapidly to the front and prevent the enemy carrying away the guns. But the officer who delivered the message, Captain Louis Nolan, and the commander of the Light Brigade, Lord Cardigan, were on the valley floor. From their perspective, they couldn't see the guns on the Causeway Heights. The only guns they could see were a formidable Russian artillery battery at the far end of a different valley, the North Valley, flanked by Russian riflemen and cavalry on both sides. A valley of death, as it would come to be known. Despite the obvious suicide mission it represented, the order was followed. "Here goes the last of the Brudenells," Lord Cardigan is said to have muttered, before leading about 670 cavalrymen straight into the jaws of the Russian cannons. The charge was both magnificent and horrifying. The horsemen galloped for over a mile under relentless fire from three sides. They reached the Russian guns and fought fiercely, but they were hopelessly outnumbered and outgunned. Within 20 minutes, the brigade was shattered, with nearly half its men killed, wounded, or captured, and almost all of their horses lost. The blunder lay not in the bravery of the soldiers, but in the vague orders and the fatal breakdown in communication between commanders, a costly lesson in the importance of clarity on the battlefield. Fast forward to 1941. Adolf Hitler, having conquered most of Western Europe, turned his gaze eastward. He launched Operation Barbarossa, the code name for the Axis invasion of the Soviet Union. This was, and remains, the largest land invasion in the history of warfare, involving over 3 million Axis soldiers, thousands of tanks, and aircraft stretched along a nearly 2,000-mile front. Hitler, like Napoleon before him, was blinded by ideology and overconfidence. He believed the Soviet Union was a rotten structure that would collapse with a single kick. He expected the war to be over before the onset of winter. History, it seems, has a dark sense of humor. The initial German advance was stunningly successful. Using their blitzkrieg tactics, they encircled and destroyed entire Soviet armies, capturing millions of prisoners. Stalin and the Soviet High Command were caught completely by surprise, and for a few months, it seemed Hitler's prediction might come true. But the Soviet Union was not France or Poland. Its sheer size was a weapon in itself. For every mile the Germans advanced, their supply lines became longer and more vulnerable to partisan attacks. The vast distances devoured fuel, ammunition, and time. The Germans captured territory, but they couldn't capture the Soviet will to fight, which only hardened under the brutality of the invasion. Then, just as it had for Napoleon, the weather turned. The autumn rains, known as the Rasputitsa, turned the unpaved roads into impassable rivers of mud, bogging down the German mechanized army. And then came the winter of 1941-42, one of the coldest on record. German soldiers still in their summer uniforms froze by the tens of thousands. Their equipment failed, oil froze in the engines and guns wouldn't fire. The Soviets, meanwhile, were equipped for the cold and launched a massive counteroffensive before Moscow. Operation Barbarossa failed to achieve its objectives, and in doing so, it opened up a brutal, bloody Eastern Front that would consume the bulk of the Wehrmacht's men and resources, ensuring Germany's ultimate defeat in World War II. After the horrors of World War I, France was determined to never again suffer a German invasion. Their solution was one of the most elaborate and expensive defensive fortifications ever built, the Maginot Line. Constructed throughout the 1930s, this was a technological marvel. It was a string of concrete bunkers, fortresses, and anti-tank obstacles stretching along the French border with Germany. Inside, it was a subterranean world with barracks, power stations, and even air conditioning and underground railways to move troops and supplies. The French military put its faith, and a massive portion of its defense budget, into this static, impenetrable wall. They believed it would force any German attack to go around it. And that's exactly what the Germans did. The French military leadership was afflicted with a Maginot mindset, a defensive posture that failed to appreciate the revolution in mobile warfare that was happening right under their noses. They assumed the dense and hilly Ardennes forest, just north of the main Maginot Line, was impassable for a large mechanized army. They left this sector lightly defended, believing it was a natural barrier. This was precisely the kind of doctrinal rigidity the German High Command was hoping for. They saw the Maginot Line not as an obstacle, but as a giant red arrow pointing to France's weak spot. In May 1940, the Germans executed the Manstein Plan. While a smaller force feigned an attack on Belgium, drawing the best Allied forces north, the main German panzer divisions punched directly through the impassable Ardennes forest. They completely bypassed the Maginot Line, crossed the Meuse River, and raced to the English Channel, encircling the bulk of the French and British armies. The impenetrable fortress was rendered instantly irrelevant without a single major assault against it. The Maginot Line stands today as a monumental symbol of how preparing to fight the last war perfectly can lead to a swift and total defeat in the next one. Our final blunder takes us to the American West, to the rolling hills of Montana, and the Battle of the Little Bighorn on June 25, 1876. Here, Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer, a flamboyant and ambitious Civil War hero, led his 7th Cavalry Regiment against a coalition of Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho tribes. The U.S. government wanted to force the tribes onto reservations to clear the way for gold prospectors in the sacred Black Hills. Custer, seeking a glorious victory that might propel him to political fame, was eager for a fight. His primary mistake, and it was a fatal one, was a profound underestimation of his enemy. Custer's intelligence reports suggested he would be facing a force of around 800 warriors. In reality, he was riding towards one of the largest gatherings of Native American warriors ever seen on the Great Plains, a village that stretched for miles along the river, with a fighting force of at least 1,500, and perhaps as many as 2,500, led by legendary figures like Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull. Compounding this error, Custer ignored his scouts' warnings about the village's immense size. Driven by a fear that the tribes would scatter if they knew he was coming, and by his own arrogance, he decided to attack immediately, without proper reconnaissance. He made another critical error. He divided his command. He split his roughly 650 men into 3 battalions, sending Captain Benteen on a wide flanking maneuver, and Major Reno to charge the southern end of the village, while he led a contingent of about 210 men to attack from the north. This division of forces in the face of a vastly superior enemy was tactical suicide. Reno's attack was quickly repulsed, and his men were routed. Custer and his command, meanwhile, were completely isolated and overwhelmed. They were surrounded, and in a desperate fight that has become legendary, every single one of them was killed. Custer's last stand became a cautionary tale about the dangers of arrogance and the failure to respect your opponent's strength and capability. So there you have it. 5 moments when hubris, poor communication, and a failure to adapt led to historic military catastrophes. From the frozen retreat from Moscow to the dusty plains of Little Bighorn, these stories serve as powerful reminders that no army is invincible. The most advanced technology, the largest numbers, and the most brilliant strategic minds can all be undone by a single, fatal miscalculation. These blunders show us that the tide of war can be turned not just by strength but by profound weakness in judgment. Even the most powerful militaries can make costly, nation-altering mistakes. The study of history isn't just about memorizing dates and names, it's about understanding the patterns of human behavior, the arrogance of Napoleon and Custer, the rigid thinking of the French High Command, the miscommunication that doomed the Light Brigade. These are human failings that are just as relevant today as they were centuries ago. By examining these epic failures, we gain a deeper appreciation for the complexities of leadership and the thin line that separates a glorious victory from a disastrous defeat. It forces us to ask critical questions about the decisions made by those in power. Ultimately, we must learn from history to avoid repeating its most painful chapters. These blunders are not just fascinating stories, they are cautionary tales written in blood. They underscore the immense responsibility that comes with command and the devastating consequences of getting it wrong. Thank you so much for watching. And as we say in my hometown, don't forget to be awesome.